Up until now, we've been looking at genetic relationships and how to look at the probabilities of those on Punnett squares. Here's a picture of what we've done so far. We looked at dominant and recessive relationships with round and wrinkled peas. We looked at incomplete dominance. We looked at codominance, and we also looked at sex-linked traits. Now let's have a look at how we can take this information a bit further, because Punnett squares are fine, but they only show us probabilities and possibilities. They don't actually trace what traits have been passed down through a family tree, and that's where pedigrees come into it. Here is a pedigree, and it looks a little bit weird at the moment, but if I tell you that the squares are the boys and the circles are the girls, and if there's a line between them that they have mated, and any offspring are denoted by this line coming down here, so they've mated and had a child in both these cases. And here you can see these children have actually mated and had more children of their own. This helps you to put together the idea that this is a family tree. Now you'll notice that I have a little box filled in below here. And you might think, what is that about? Well, I'll tell you now, that is a symbol to show that someone has the disease cystic fibrosis. Now, this is one child out of this entire family that's ended up with cystic fibrosis. And the question is this: how did they get it when no one else in their family seemed to show signs of the disease? That is where pedigrees come into play. And we have to start understanding and going back to the different relationships that we learnt of and looking at how that affects a person's ability to inherit a specific trait or phenotype. And in this case, the phenotype is cystic fibrosis, the disease. So let's quickly go back and do a little bit of an overview of the different relationships and how they fit into pedigrees. Okay, so a pedigree specifically traces a trait or a phenotype throughout a family. You can't have lots and lots of traits shown on a pedigree. It's just too confusing. So you pick one trait that you're following, one phenotype, and you trace its appearance through a family tree. Now, when you look at these traits, you then have to start analyzing them and figuring out what genetic relationship actually is in play here. And remember, we have several relationships we've learnt about. We've learnt about recessive dominant relationships, incomplete dominance, codominance, and sex-linked relationships. Now, when it comes to recessive and dominant relationships, there's two new terms here we're going to introduce: autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive. Autosomal dominant means you only need one copy of that trait in order to show it, and autosomal recessive means that you actually need two copies of that trait in order to show it, which is exactly what we've already learnt. But in the case of disease, it comes a little bit more clear why we need these two terms. Huntington's disease is a disease that's what we call autosomal dominant, which means you only need one copy of the bad allele to get the disease. The normal gene for undiseased is actually a recessive. So someone with Huntington's disease receives a dominant allele from one parent and they get the disease. Now, the horrible thing about Huntington's disease is you don't actually start to show symptoms of this until you're in your 40s, which is usually after people have had kids. So they've already passed this allele on to some of their children. There's a 50-50 chance their kids will get it, because half of their eggs and sperm will actually be infected with the Huntington's disease allele. So it's a pretty nasty disease for people to get. Now, cystic fibrosis, which is the one we showed just before, is an autosomal recessive. So for cystic fibrosis, for you to get that, you actually have to have two recessive alleles. So someone is safe from cystic fibrosis unless they actually have two recessive alleles for it. But because it's an autosomal recessive disease, it means you can have people who are carriers. So they can have one normal allele and one cystic fibrosis allele. They won't show the disease, but they will carry it, which starts to help us to understand how that one child in that third generation got that disease, and we'll go back to that in a second. You can also have incomplete dominant relationships when it comes to genetic diseases, and one example of this is Tay-Sachs. Now, this is a disease that's often seen in Jews, and it means that they have a wild type of enzyme which actually doesn't work properly in breaking down lipids. And that doesn't sound too bad, but what actually happens is that the lipids or fats will accumulate in the brain and end up killing the person who has the disease. This is the genotype for someone with Tay-Sachs that would actually die by the age of 5 because of lipid buildup in the brain. They have 2 affected alleles. If they have 1 affected allele and 1 normal allele, they'll actually have half the enzyme production that they need of a normal human, but they will survive. So this is an incomplete dominance relationship. And of course, other people who don't have this disease in their family have 2 normal alleles. Now, an example of a codominant relationship is sickle cell anemia. Now, sickle cell is actually where the blood cells of the affected individuals have a funny shape to them and they don't carry oxygen very well. And when the blood becomes acidic, like when you've been running an awful lot and you have a lot of CO2 in your blood, the sickle cells will actually precipitate and become solid in the person's blood vessels, and it can actually clog blood vessels and cause huge amounts of pain. Now, a lot of people with sickle cell will actually die at a very young age, but there is a codominant relationship here, which means that not everyone does suffer the disease in its full form. What happens is, if you have sickle cell and you are homozygous for it, you will have an extreme part of the disease and you will normally die at a very young age of anemia. If you have 1 copy of sickle cell and you have 1 copy of the normal gene, you'll actually have half of your blood cells normal and they'll be able to carry oxygen fine, and half of them sickle cell. So you won't be able to carry oxygen as well as everyone else. And you would think that that's a huge disadvantage, but the fact is, if you have half and half genes, sickle cell anemia actually gives you an advantage, because it means that you can't be affected with malaria, which is another disease that is quite common in Africa. And of course, the other type of combination is normal, where you don't actually carry the sickle cell allele at all. The last type of relationship we looked at was hemophilia. Now, hemophilia is actually a blood clotting disorder, and it is a recessive allele because it will only appear if you have no good alleles present to actually cause blood clotting. But because it's on the X chromosome, it poses a problem for boys because they do not have a backup X chromosome if they have a defective allele for blood clotting. So females can again be carriers, just like up here with cystic fibrosis, autosomal recessive. They can be carriers, but if they pass on their defective allele to their son, because he has to get his Y from his father, then that means that that son will definitely have hemophilia because he has no backup copy. This girl here, because she has the normal gene as well, she will be fine for her blood clotting, but she's a carrier for hemophilia. You very rarely get girls who have hemophilia, because you'd have to have a male who survived to adulthood with hemophilia and a female who's a carrier, combining their genes to give you a girl who has hemophilia. Alright, let's go and put these relationships into some family trees. Now, let's start with the cystic fibrosis relationship. Remember how I said it's autosomal recessive? Let's look at how that could be in this diagram here. Okay, so this person here has cystic fibrosis. And we know if they have cystic fibrosis, they have to have 2 copies of the bad gene. Now, the only way this person could have gotten 2 copies of the bad gene is if they got 1 copy from each of their parents. Now, that means that their parents aren't showing the disease up here, but that means that they must be heterozygous. Now, to be heterozygous, that means you've got one bad copy of the trait we're looking at. So on this genetic family tree here, we're going to colour it in by half, which means that these parents had to have been what we call heterozygous for cystic fibrosis, because each one of them had to donate a little cystic fibrosis gene to this child here for him to actually get the disease. So we can actually use these family trees to figure out what people's genotypes are. Now, for this parent here to be heterozygous, it means that they had to have received this allele from one of their parents up here. So one of their parents is a carrier for cystic fibrosis, but without looking back further in the genetic tree, you wouldn't know which one. This parent here too carries cystic fibrosis, so one of their parents is a carrier as well. So let me just fill in the genetic tree a bit, because I already know the answer to this one. In this case here, the grandfather was a carrier because cystic fibrosis comes from his family tree, and the mother here, or grandmother actually, was a carrier for cystic fibrosis too. So every time you see a shape coloured in half like that, you know that they are heterozygous for whatever trait you're looking at. They have one copy of the allele. Now, the other children here look unaffected, but further testing will tell us this. These two females are carriers, and one female, actually escaped entirely and doesn't carry the cystic fibrosis gene, which means she is big C, big C. She ended up getting this copy from her dad and this copy from her mum. And that's this family's pedigree, or their genetic family tree. Now you're going to be looking at a whole heap of different problems with these, and they're going to be covering several different relationships, mostly recessive and dominant ones, but we might throw in a few of the other ones as well, especially the sex-linked traits. Now, when you are looking at pedigrees, there's a few other symbols and rules that you have to learn when writing these genetic trees. So we're going to look at them now. Okay, so here are the basic symbols we use whenever we're doing family pedigrees. Circles, of course, are female, and squares are male. If you have a fully filled in circle, it means that you show the trait that we're tracing. It can be a disease, it can simply be the presence of either blue eyes or brown eyes, or what type of hair you have, but you show the trait that's being traced, the phenotype. If you have a half circle or a half square, that means that you're heterozygous for that trait, so you're a carrier, but you're not actually showing it. And if you have a line between individuals, male and female, that means that they have mated. If you have a line coming down from that mating and going out to other different shapes of boys and or girls, it means that they have had offspring. If those offspring are joined by a triangular shape like this, that means they're identical twins. If they're joined by two lines like this but none joining them in between, that means they're non-identical twins. If there's a line through someone like this, that means they're dead. And every generation in the family is denoted by Roman symbols to show what generation it is when we're referring to it in our talking. Because when we look at an individual, we'll actually have each generation numbered and each individual in a family tree numbered as well. I'll show you an example of that now. The first worksheet that you'll be looking at has this diagram on it, and it's actually looking at the genetic relationships of one family in one town, and we're looking at the presence of a disease that's actually being transferred. And as you can see, you've got this person here who's a male who had the disease and died, a female here who didn't have the disease and died, two affected individuals who had the disease but had a child without it. You can see that there's 3 generations of the family shown here, and each person in each line has their own number designated to them, and we restart that numbering for every new successive generation. So here's a question. The individual 2-5 in the pedigree, can you tell me which one of these is correct for describing them? 2-5. Now if you go up to generation 2, go across and find individual 5, here they are. That is a male. They don't show the presence of the disease, and his wife is deceased. One of his children has the disease, his daughter, but his son does not. So, is it a male who does not exhibit the trait? Yes. Is he a father? Yes. Has 3 affected siblings? Let's see. Go up here and let's look at his siblings. His sister has the disease, his brother has the disease, and his other sister has the disease. So the answer is actually all above. Now let's go down a little bit further here. This is a large pedigree that looks at it across a large number of generations. Now notice here a few other interesting things that you'll be looking at. This individual here, this lady, has actually got several lines going to her for mating, or I guess in this case marriage. She's actually had 1, 2, 3 husbands, and each of them have had offspring with her. So you can actually see that she's an affected individual as well. So she's actually had offspring with 3 other men and passed that trait on. We have some very large number of children in some of these families. The disease is quite prevalent. There's another female that's married twice. So you actually have to look at this and really learn how to tell the story when you look at a pedigree to try and figure out where the disease has come from, who's got it, and who could pass it on. So here's a question. This large pedigree was collected from an extended family in the small town. Is it true that this disease is very severe and strikes early in childhood? Well, have a think. If these people are affected, but they're living long enough to marry not once, not twice, but 3 times and have kids, I don't think it strikes early in childhood, so the answer is false. And question 3. This large pedigree shows a dominant trait because most males are affected by it, the family is very large, the trait shows up every generation, or filled symbols always show dominance. Well, let's have a think about it. If most males are affected, that means it's a sex-linked trait, not a dominant trait. And sex links are usually recessive, so that one's incorrect. The large pedigree shows a dominant trait because the family is large? No, I don't think so, because if the family is very large and it was a dominant trait, that means you only had to have 1 copy of that trait in order to get the disease. Now, that would normally affect a pedigree and reduce the size of the family. Next, the trait shows up every generation. Well, does it? Let's have a look. It does show up every generation. And does filled symbols always show dominance? Well, no, they don't, because if you remember back to our notes on this, the filled symbols simply show that you are showing the phenotype that we're tracing, in this case the disease. It doesn't tell us whether it's dominant or not. Now, if you do have a dominant trait, it usually will show up every generation unless they're... The answer is C. The trait shows up every generation. That's how we know it's a dominant one. Because if you have a dominant trait, say brown eyes even, you only need 1 copy of that allele to actually pass it on. So you'll end up having that trait show up in its homozygous or heterozygous version every generation. you will only have it skipping generations if it's a recessive trait. So the fact that we can actually see this showing up in every generation means it is a dominant trait. Okay, you're going to be going and doing a whole heap of these pedigree problems and figuring out what type of relationships they are and tracing the genetic phenotypes through the family tree in order to solve some more brain teasers. So good luck, have fun.